Okay, welcome to lesson 18, and this lesson is actually one of the most theoretical lessons in the entire class. So you might want to watch it a couple of times, and it might really crystallize once we get to essay 4, but I think it's nice to present this lesson here because it can also help you as you're writing essay 3. In this lesson, we're going to talk about logic and logical reasoning. So we have 5 objectives for this lesson. First, we're going to understand the 2 major logical reasoning systems, induction and deduction, and the differences between the two and how they sometimes work together. Second, we're going to understand Tolman's model of argument, how Tolman says that arguments rely on assumptions and how to identify assumptions in arguments in order to evaluate them critically. Third, we're going to talk about some major logical fallacies that authors often use in place of sound reasoning. And I'm going to show you 7 of the major ones that I think are the most important. And they're kind of funny too, so it'll be exciting when we get to that part. After this lesson, I want you to complete Journal 5. So for Journal 5, I want you to read 2 short articles on gay marriage. One is by Katha Pollitt, and it's called What's Wrong with Gay Marriage? And the other one's by Charles Colson, and it's called Gay Marriage, Societal Suicide. Obviously, these take 2 completely different stances on gay marriage. They're really interesting. They're both handouts. They're not in the book. They're handouts. And they're under the course portal under MyCC under handouts. You can find Pollitt's What's Wrong with Gay Marriage and Colson's Gay Marriage, Societal Suicide. So I want you to download both of those, read both of those, and for Journal 5, I want you to briefly summarize each of those and then analyze each of them. Similar to how you did in Journal 4. So look at the different appeals that each use and think about which argument is stronger and why the argument is stronger. But for this journal, I want you to deduce a conclusion. So we're going to talk about deduction in this essay. In this lesson, I want you to deduce a conclusion about which argument you think is stronger and why. So you have to have an ultimate conclusion or thesis for this journal that's based on your analysis of both the essays. So let's start with a quick review. In lesson 16, I talked about the 3 appeals of argument, the logical appeal, the ethical appeal, and the emotional appeal, and how to evaluate arguments critically. In that lesson, I also looked at some ads, and we looked at a full-length essay so we can see how to analyze effectively. In lesson 17, I also did a sample analysis of the 2 essays on steroids and sports, and I looked closely at both of those essays in terms of the logic. What's the thesis and how do the authors support the thesis with the evidence? And the emotional appeals that both authors use. How do they appeal to our emotions? And finally, I talked about the ethical appeal for both and how and whether or not each article is trustworthy, and in what ways the authors are credible or not credible. So hopefully these examples helped you to see how to think critically about arguments and evaluate them based on those 3 appeals, the logical, the emotional, and the ethical. Of the 3 appeals, ethical is probably the most convincing, right? That's really the underlying current that you're really looking for is, do I trust this author? Is the author ethical or not ethical? But the ethical appeal is based on author's background and tone, but primarily on an author's logic, right? So if an author doesn't have that strong of a background, but an author does have strong logic or valid reasoning, we're more likely to believe what he or she is saying. So that should really be your primary concern when you're looking at a text, is you want to think about the reasoning that an author is using and whether or not that reasoning is valid, right? Is there a strong thesis? Does the author have enough support for that thesis? And does the author use evidence to back that thesis? In this sense, logical reasoning is primary, and that's what we're going to talk about a little bit more in this lesson, is understanding valid reasoning from invalid reasoning in argument. So good logic starts with sound method of reasoning. There's primarily 2 ways of reasoning that authors can use when constructing arguments. The inductive method of reasoning starts with a generalization and then moves into specific examples to support that generalization. Deductive reasoning, on the other hand, doesn't start with a generalization or a theory. It starts with observations of specific examples and draws a generalization based on those specific examples. Here's a graphic I found online. So when we're reasoning inductively, we start with a theory or a thesis. and then we make some observations, and then we confirm whether or not that theory or thesis is true. In deductive reasoning, we don't start with a theory or thesis. We start with a vague idea of what we might eventually want to have as a theory or thesis. But primarily we start with observations of the world, and we see, are there patterns in the observations that we're seeing? And as a result of those patterns, we come up with a theory. So it works the opposite way. I know that's a little bit vague, but let's take a closer look at both of these and see if you can understand the difference between inductive and deductive logic. So in inductive reasoning, we start with a general idea or a general theory or a thesis. And then we make observations in the real world or empirical data to confirm the theory. So whenever we're making observations of the real world to support something that's a theory or theoretical, we're using empirical strategies, right? We're looking at things from the real world in order to draw a larger theory. It's called empirical or empiricism, confirming a theory with real-world observations. So if we start with a general theory or a thesis, and then we go out and we observe one kind of instance, and we find some empirical data for that instance, and then we observe a second kind of instance, and we find real-world or empirical data to support that instance, and then we find a third specific instance, and we find empirical data to support that specific instance. Here we're using inductive reasoning. So in this sense, the 5-paragraph essay, like from argument 1, is a form of inductive reasoning or of inductive argument. Right? When we think about it, it conforms to inductive reasoning. We start with a theory or a thesis, and then we find one reason to support the thesis, a second reason with empirical data to support the thesis, and a third reason with empirical data to support the thesis. So in this sense, the theory or the thesis is confirmed or supported by what we see in the real world. So for instance, when our theory or thesis is kids under 13 should not be allowed to have Facebook accounts, we could start that way, and then we turn to empirical studies. So we turn to the real world to see, is this true or is this not true? And when we're looking in the real world, we might find that a lot of kids that we're seeing in the real world post inappropriate pictures. So this observation supports the idea that kids should not be allowed to have Facebook accounts. And as we're studying the real world, we also find that a lot of kids spend a lot of time on Facebook. And there's lots of examples of kids that spend late nights posting things on Facebook or studying other people's Facebook pages. And that also supports our thesis. And then maybe we find some observations in the real world in the news of pedophiles who lure kids off of Facebook. And that empirical evidence also supports the thesis. So we've confirmed our thesis with things we've seen in the real world. So that's inductive reasoning. Let's take a look at deductive reasoning. So deductive reasoning is kind of the opposite. So when we deduce or use deductive reasoning, we're observing things in the real world without a set theory in mind, right? We're just mostly studying the empirical world to see what's happening in the world. And based on our observations, we arrive at a general theory or a thesis. I've deduced a conclusion, Watson. Here's the graphic for deductive reasoning. So we might have just a general area of inquiry. We don't really have a specific theory or thesis, just a general area of inquiry that we're interested in deducing a theory from. So we go into the general area of inquiry. We look at the empirical research from the real world, some specific observations of things we're seeing, and then we deduce a general theory. So it's kind of the opposite of what I said before. So if we're interested in kids on Facebook, maybe we go out and we study the behavior of kids in Facebook, and we might notice that there are some positive behaviors, and we might notice that there are some negative behaviors, right? And so maybe we notice that kids are posting inappropriate pictures, but maybe we also notice that kids are connecting with friends, which is a positive thing. But then we also notice that kids are being lured by pedophiles. But then maybe we also notice that kids are able to play games and connect with their families more. So we have a couple of pros and a couple of cons, and we sort of weigh all of this evidence and we say, overall, I think kids should not be allowed to have Facebook because even though there are some of those benefits, there are problems instead. So when we're using deductive reasoning, we're really interested in coming to the correct conclusion, right? Like Sherlock Holmes, always coming to the correct conclusion. So we're studying all patterns and all sides to arrive at our theory or thesis. So the difference is subtle, but it's an important distinction to make as a researcher and as a writer of arguments. Comparisons are deductive arguments, right? So when we look at two things to see which one is stronger or which one is better or which one has, better qualities than something else, we're trying to deduce a conclusion based on our observation of those two things. We don't start with a theory or conclusion. We're interested in studying the two things separately and deducing the conclusion. So in this sense, when I asked you to analyze Villagomez and Martin and then draw a conclusion about which argument is stronger, and I'm also asking you in Journal 5 to analyze the two arguments on gay marriage and then deduce a conclusion about which is stronger. When I ask you to do that, I'm asking you to make a deductive argument based on your observations. So unlike the 5-paragraph essay where your thesis comes in the introduction, in a comparison or a deductive argument, your generalization or thesis comes in the conclusion after your observations or as a result of your observations. So there are many advantages to inductive and deductive reasoning, and there are many reasons why a researcher or an author might choose inductive over deductive or deductive over inductive. Inductive reasoning can make strong arguments because an author already knows and tells us up front what he or she is trying to prove, right? And in this sense, the author can sell the argument to us, right? And that can be pretty convincing. However, on the other hand, deductive argument or deductive reasoning can make strong arguments because they tend to be a lot more objective, right? We're really interested in finding the truth, not proving our point when we use deduction. And that can be pretty convincing to a reader as well. So here's a little comparison of some of the advantages and disadvantages of both. So when we're making a deductive argument, we have a clear thesis up front, and then we can sell our point to the reader. That can be pretty convincing, but it can also come across as biased or not credible, like Martin in Destroyed, right? He comes across as biased and uncredible because he clearly is not really looking at the other side or not considering the other side. And so an inductive argument can fail if an argument comes across as biased or not credible, but it can also fail if an author doesn't have enough support to back up his or her thesis. Deductive argument, on the other hand, doesn't have a clear thesis up front, so it might seem a little bit more wishy-washy than an inductive argument, which might seem a little bit more direct. In a deductive argument, you're studying each point with the reader, so you're kind of going along with the reader, and that actually helps an author of a deductive argument to appear a lot more neutral. So as a general rule, deductive arguments do appear and usually are much more neutral, which is usually more credible. But a deductive argument can fail if an author doesn't draw the correct conclusion. So as you're studying the points with the reader, you need to be really careful that you're balancing those points and that you draw your conclusion correctly based on the points that you're balancing. There's why an author might choose to use one over another and why you might choose to use one over another. In research, researchers actually use both inductive and deductive reasoning. And you're going to see this once we get to Essay 4. So for Essay 1, I asked you to use inductive reasoning. Start with the thesis and then support it with examples from the real world. In Essay 3, which I'm going to assign in the next lesson, I'm asking you to use deductive reasoning to start with some observations of two articles and then deduce a conclusion. But in Essay 4, you're going to use both. Whenever you're conducting research, you usually start with deduction. So you start by studying observations in order to arrive at a thesis. So we might have a general area of inquiry that we're looking at, and then we make some observations based on that general area of inquiry, and ultimately we arrive at a thesis based on that area of inquiry. And then when it comes time to write the argument, we typically turn to induction, right? So we do the opposite. Now that we have our thesis and we know what it is that we want to prove because we've deduced it logically, then we want to, as we're writing, put our thesis up front and give several reasons to support that thesis. And these reasons are the things that we found in our observations from deduction. So typically a researcher will use both deduction and induction in the process. So let's turn now to another element of logical reasoning, which was created by a logical theorist, Stephen Tolman. So Stephen Tolman said, no matter which kind of reasoning we're using, inductive or deductive, an author needs to connect claims to empirical observations. So these are the two components of argument, right? Whether we're arguing inductively or deductively, we have a claim. Either we're starting with a claim and then supporting that claim with empirical observations, or we're making empirical observations in order to ultimately draw a claim, which is deduction. So induction, we start with the claim, and then we support it with empirical observations. Deduction, we make empirical observations, we deduce a claim. However, Tolman said that there's a third component of argument, right, which is assumptions. So an empirical observation is never direct proof of a claim. The link always rests on assumptions. So let's take a look at an example of this. If my ultimate claim is child beauty pageants should be banned. So if I want to make this claim, child beauty pageants could be banned, maybe that's my theory, then I could go out and study the empirical data, the empirical evidence in the real world, and I find that child beauty pageants are pretty expensive. And I make the assumption that spending money on pageants is a bad thing, then that ultimately allows me to create the theory child beauty pageants should be banned, right? So being very expensive by itself doesn't necessarily prove that they should be banned. This relies on the assumption that spending money is a bad thing. However, I could also make the opposite claim. Child beauty pageants should be promoted or should not be banned. And I could base it on the same empirical evidence that they're very expensive. And I could just rely on the different assumption that spending money on pageants is a good thing, right? So if I think spending money on pageants is a good thing, then I'll deduce the thesis that child beauty pageants should be promoted. If I see it as a bad thing, I'll deduce the conclusion that child beauty pageants should be banned. Same argument, same empirical evidence, different theory based on a different assumption. So in one case, I might think, when parents spend money, a lot of parents who put their kids in child beauty pageants don't have that much money, so spending money is kind of a bad thing. On the other instance, I might be saying, when parents spend money on pageants, they're boosting the economy, so that's a good thing. They're helping small businesses. So you could draw totally different conclusions based on the same evidence if you're using different assumptions. So when an author makes an assumption, he or she's using logic to connect the claim to the evidence. If the logic makes sense, we say that's sound logic. If the logic does not make sense, we say that it's faulty logic. In this case, I would say both pieces of logic could be sound depending on how you explain it. So in evaluating arguments, or while creating your own arguments, you need to make sure you consider the logic, the empirical evidence that an author provides, and how well that connects to the author's overall claim. So you want to make sure that the author isn't committing any logical fallacies, which are common types of faulty reasoning. And there are many types of faulty reasoning that happen often. These are called logical fallacies. And we're going to look at 7 different logical fallacies just so you can get the idea of some of the tactics that authors use instead of actually making sound reasoning. So let's turn to those fallacies now. So one logical fallacy that I've actually mentioned twice now is the ad hoc logical fallacy. So when an argument relies on a faulty causation or assumes a cause based on a correlation, they're making the ad hoc logical fallacy. So we saw this with fast food as fat food. Remember, she tried to say that fast food leads to obesity because they seem correlated. And in Martin's Destroyed, he does the same thing. He says steroids seem to cause health issues because the one player's health issues seem to be correlated to steroids. But the problem is that It's very hard to assume a cause based on correlation. And remember, I showed you that graphic with the correlation between murders and ice cream sales, right? It's very hard to prove causation in any case. So here's an example of an ad hoc logical fallacy. If somebody says, I ate a loaf of bread and I got a cold a few days later, I must have gotten sick from the bread I ate. Sickness probably has nothing to do with the bread, right? And this person is drawing the causation or conclusion based on a faulty correlation. Here's another one. This is from the Dilbert comic. Someone sent me another anonymous email with a link to an article about the world's worst bosses. I get one of these emails every time I leave your cubicle. Did you think I wouldn't notice the correlation? And then Dilbert's saying sort of snidely behind his cubicle, correlation does not imply causation. So he knows about the ad hoc fallacy, and he's saying that this guy's committing the ad hoc fallacy because he's connecting that correlation with a causation. But in this case, it does seem like probably Dilbert did send the emails, and he's kind of being ironic here. But that's the idea of the ad hoc logical fallacy. Is just be careful whenever an author is saying one thing causes another. It's very hard to prove that. Another type of logical fallacy that authors use a lot is called slippery slope. So this is when an argument asserts that one event must necessarily follow another event without any explanation of why it's inevitable. It's when you go to the extremes of things. So here's an example of a comic with a therapist and a client. And the therapist makes a slippery slope logical fallacy in here. So the client comes in and says, would I be a bad father if I just went to sleep and let Lionel jump on his bed all night long? And the therapist says, of course not. There's a slight chance that would lead to a cycle of permissiveness, and that will grow up spoiled and feeling entitled to the point where we become narcissistic and turn to a life of crime. Just kidding, maybe. And then this guy's saying, can I see your credentials? So he's sort of calling him out on his slippery slope here. So this is the slippery slope. Here he's sort of just assuming that one event will follow the next, which will follow the next, which will follow the next. But we can't make assumptions that far into the future. So this is a logical fallacy. Another type of logical fallacy is called the Strawman logical fallacy. And this is when you misrepresent somebody else's argument to make it easier to attack. So like I talked about with essay 1, it's important to represent other people's points of views in your essay. But when you bring in an author's point of view or a counter-argument that goes against your view, you want to make sure that you represent that view fairly. When you don't represent it fairly, you're committing the Strawman logical fallacy. So here's an example of a Strawman logical fallacy, and this is a spoof of President Obama. And it says, by cutting spending, Republicans mean they want to destroy our schools, kill the elderly, and starve the poor, and their discourse is very uncivil. So in this case, probably Republicans don't want to destroy our schools, kill the elderly, and starve the poor, but that's the way Obama is misrepresenting their points of view. So this is a good example of straw man, because that's not really the point of view of the Republicans. Another logical fallacy is the red herring logical fallacy, and this one happens a lot in argument. And this is when somebody making an argument brings in an irrelevant topic in order to divert the audience from the real point. Here's my red herring. I'm here to distract you. And here's an example of the red herring logical fallacy. How can you convict this man of murdering his mother? He's an orphan. It's sad that he's an orphan, but it doesn't have anything to do with why he committed the murder, right? So instead of actually addressing the murder and defending the client, he's sort of distracting the audience by bringing in another irrelevant point. So be on the lookout for that when an author brings in an irrelevant point. Another logical fallacy is the ad hominem logical fallacy, and this one happens a lot in sort of arguments, intimate arguments in families. Rather than addressing the actual argument at hand, the person engaging in this fallacy just attacks the person. So if somebody makes a logical argument, instead of arguing back, you'd say, well, I don't like you, or something like that, or well, you're ugly, or something like that. So you're just attacking the person instead of actually making an argument. Here's an example from a comic. So pushing the envelope, it's called. So Jimmy Carter was a lousy president, this person says. And then Jimmy Carter's here saying, at least I was elected president, Senator McCain. So in this case, McCain is making a logical argument. Carter was a lousy president. And then Carter, instead of defending his presidency, just says, well, at least I was elected president. You weren't. So he's kind of attacking the senator instead. So just be on the lookout for any time somebody's attacking somebody in the argument as opposed to actually arguing against. That's the ad hominem logical fallacy. The ad populum logical fallacy is an emotional appeal that speaks to a positive, such as patriotism or religion or democracy, or a negative, such as terrorism or fascism, or deal with these sorts of concepts of good and bad as opposed to the real issue at hand. So here's an example. This guy in the 1960s is saying, we're just protecting the sanctity of marriage, and he has an X over interracial marriage. And then today, he's saying what he said, and he has the X over gay marriage. So in this case, we're not really making a sound argument so much as relying on concepts of good and bad, right? So we're just protecting sanctity of marriage, which is good. He's sort of saying the same thing here. So that's the ad populum. It's an emotional appeal that speaks to the positives or negatives, right? So like good versus evil type appeals. And then finally is the either-or logical fallacy. So this is a conclusion that oversimplifies an argument by reducing it to only two sides or two choices. Here's a great example of one from George Bush. Either you're with us or you're with the terrorists. Good example of either or. There's no middle ground here, right? He's saying either you're an American, you're with us, or you're a terrorist, right? So whenever an author says there's only two possibilities, it's usually over-reductive. And that's the either-or logical fallacy. Here's another one from a sort of common commercial that we see a lot, from the MasterCard commercial. There are some things that money can't buy. For everything else, there's MasterCard. It's like there's only two choices. Either you can use your MasterCard or you can't use your MasterCard. There's no sort of middle ground in here. So that's the either-or logical fallacy. So it's nice to know about these logical fallacies, and they're interesting to study and to see. And as you're looking at your arguments, you want to sort of see if you notice any of these logical fallacies or not. So let's wrap up real quick. When evaluating arguments or writing your own arguments, you want to make sure that you carefully consider your logic. Consider the type of reasoning system, right? Inductive and deductive, or use both, right? Also look closely at the assumptions connecting the evidence or empirical evidence to the claim. And be careful of the logical fallacies. There are many, many logical fallacies, but I talked about the seven of the most common ones in this lesson. So be especially on the lookout for ad hoc logical fallacy. When you're assuming causation based on correlation, be careful of the slippery slope when somebody just goes to the extremes. Be careful of the straw man when somebody holds up an argument but doesn't represent it fairly. Be careful of the red herring when somebody distracts from actually arguing and brings up an irrelevant issue. Be careful of ad hominem when somebody attacks somebody else. Be careful of ad populum when somebody relies on concepts of good and evil. And be careful of either or when somebody reduces an argument to either this or that. So a strong use of logic goes a long way in building ethos, and that's why it's important to evaluate logic carefully. So here's your assignment. So before moving on to lesson 19, where I'll review the assignment sheet for essay 3 and a sample critical comparison, I want you to complete Journal 5. So for Journal 5, I want you to read two short essays on gay marriage. One's by Kathy Pollitt. It's called What's Wrong with Gay Marriage, and the other one's by Charles Colson. It's called Gay Marriage, Societal Suicide. These are both handouts. So after reading these, I want you to briefly summarize and analyze each, similar to what you did in Journal 4, and try to deduce a conclusion about which argument is stronger and why. So use your deduction here, and also, as you're analyzing, be on the lookout for logic. Do you notice any of those logical appeals? Are there any problems with assumptions? Is the author using induction or deduction? So be sure to look closely at those, and then turn in this journal, and then I'll give you feedback on it, and you can move on to the next lesson. And I'll see you there. Bye.